just recording.
Yeah, what's that?
Can you hear me? All right. Before we get started, I want to just get a sense of the room. Is there anybody in the room who does not write code? Awesome, I'm not alone. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to both sides of the room. Anybody in the room who has not worked with an Agile or Lean or one of those kinds of frameworks?
I've only been doing Agile for like 20 years. Does that count as an expert?
That counts. Anybody who, and this is probably the switch now, anybody who's never been in a plan-driven like waterfall? Haven't escaped yet. Okay. So there's a big rivalry between the two of them. It's almost a religious war, and I come from the school that's, like, you've been around for a long time, seen a lot of different things, and the methodology doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, waterfall can be more flexible and agile than you think, and agile should be a little more structured than most people make it. Am I not doing this right? So this is Sandi's theory of innovation. It's like music. I have a music degree, so I have to throw it in somewhere. I grew up in the classical music tradition, where literally your whole job is to recreate the way something was played 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and it can be gorgeous, very structured. You know exactly what you're going to get. But you're not going to be surprised. You're not going to come up with any big breakthroughs. I stopped playing the French horn when I realized that my job was to recreate what some guy recorded in 1950. Not really interesting. On the other hand, if you don't have enough structure, you get cacophony. Everybody doing their own thing. That's kind of like being in the practice rooms at the university where everybody's practicing something different, and this poor little kid can't take it. Jazz is in between. So a lot of people think of jazz as just free-for-all. It doesn't sound structured. There's all this improvisation, but really what's happening is everybody's agreed on a framework. There's chord progressions, there's a tempo, there's some building blocks. We're going to do 2 choruses and then a bridge. And then within that, everybody gets to be creative and do their own thing, and you know it's going to work together because you've got that kind of structure. So that's how I approach structure in dev projects. Just enough to keep everybody on the same page, get to the same place, but not so much that you're not going to be surprised and delighted. So I've been hearing for, in my case, it's been 12 years since I discovered Agile. So I've been hearing for 12 years how Agile solves all the problems. I spent a lot of time in big telcos that were really process heavy, and they turned out really bad stuff. So the equation's pretty simple. Waterfall and plan driven, bad stuff. But when those companies tried to do Agile, it was a disaster because it was really approached as, now we don't need requirements, now we don't need to talk to one another, we'll just go, and you think you're headed for the guy on the left, sailing through beautifully, and this is usually what we ended up with. On the other hand, waterfall, where it works, there's this myth that you need all the requirements to be absolutely complete. You need to know exactly what you're going to deliver before you start. And the thing is, you never do. You never can. So it's really everything I'm going to say following this has applicability on waterfall and Agile. I put this message up here because it reminded me of a project where we really learned this, where both the business side and the IT side had sort of adopted this mythology that whatever the business put on the paper, that's what we're going to do, and they can like it or lump it because that's what they asked for. And this is the kind of message I ended up with. I had customers looking at messages that said something went wrong. Like, hey, well, how does that happen? Well, the business didn't say, they just said error message, so we just put an error message. That's sad. But it happens. Okay, good. Back about, I guess it's 11 years now, there's a book called Balancing Agility and Discipline by a couple of guys who went into the massive theory. I can lend you the book if you want. There's a lot that they say in there and that's still relevant. I reread it every couple of years. But this is the rule that I took out of a really thick book. Is it riskier for me to apply more of this process component or refrain from applying it? It's a fancy way of saying, don't use any more process and rules and structures than you need to. And their advice is always, if you're starting a project, build from chaos up instead of structure down. If you're trying to take a lot of rules and regulations and processes and structure and rigidity and make that flow and make it flexible, it's not going to happen. But if you start the other way, you can introduce processes that will solve a problem. Now look at my buddy Julio in the back in the red t-shirt. We spent a lot of time last year, and one of our big pain points was figuring out what had actually been tested by dev and was going to be ready to be tested by the business. How was that all flowing? We found a pain point, so we put a little process, we call it process, I call it maybe a 1, 2, 3 step, put it in place, we all agreed to it, and on we go. We didn't have to have a big heavy methodology, but we had to have something. So that's the approach I always like. Leave the process out unless you really need it. Seems obvious. You want to have a shared goal. Everybody's going to the same place. Problem is, I don't think I've ever walked into a project where everybody shared and understood the goal. In fact, a lot of times, the tech team doesn't even know the goal. You're not told what you're doing, you're just farmed out. And this is more in larger organizations, but it's like, here we need you to build this. Why are we building it? Who's going to use it? What problem are we? They don't have that, and I think it's absolutely critical. So if you're on the dev side and you don't know why you're doing this, bug the business side until they tell you, because as soon as you understand why you're doing it, then you can give them better feedback and improve their sucky requirements, my other talk about requirements. But if you don't know what you're trying to do, you can't help them help themselves. But here's my big one. Goals and deliverables are not the same thing. You walk into a project, you ask team members what the goal is, and they'll often tell you exactly what they've been told to deliver. I love the Pac-Man pizza, by the way. Totally stole that from the internet. Makes me hungry. But if you talk to a lot of people on teams, they'll say, well, the goal of this project is to implement a shopping cart to do this many transactions. Well, the goal is to be able to sell stuff to people and make them want to buy it and get through it. Those are two different things. You can have everybody agree on the goal and it doesn't change, but how you do it, that's going to change. Sometimes you end up building a different feature than you even thought. Probably not in the case of a shopping cart, but sometimes we'll build something other than what we thought we needed, because as everybody gets into understanding, well, what's actually going to make the goal happen? If the goal is customer satisfaction or shorter queue times or whatever the goal is, then if you understand the goal and you bug the business owner and make them tell you and actually make them think, because half the time they don't know either. They've been given an assignment to deliver X and they tell you to build it for them. They don't know why. But push them. Never accept, I don't know what the goal is. And if you hear at least 2 different answers, you haven't got a consensus. You got to go back. Communication. Again, pretty obvious, right? You got to communicate. I say you got to over-communicate. Even in small groups, I've come into projects in companies that have less than 10 people in the whole company, and people aren't talking to one another. I come in as a consultant, and I'm the bridge to make that communication happen, and I'm saying, well, why am I telling you that? Why isn't he telling you? He's at the next desk. You have to sort of make up for that. It's human nature. I've seen it in the biggest companies and the smallest companies. If you don't do it yourself, it doesn't get done. One of my first Rogers projects, I walked in and I got a phone call about midway through my first day and said, there's a meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, you've got to be on it, it's chaos. So I went into the meeting. Half the team, the business side, was in the room I was in. The whole technical team was in a room in Brampton. And they were yelling obscenities at one another through the phone bridge. I should have known at that point not to stay at Rogers, but it took me a few years. But that's literally what it decayed to. And all we did to get it back on track was I found a couple of people on the IT side who were willing to talk and communicate. And I went out to their place and they came over to ours, and before, it was probably about 2 months to get everybody in a room and get them talking. Once they communicated, all of the bun fights about whose fault things were got replaced by discussions about how to actually get it done. So communication is your job, no matter who you are, developer, business lead, it's you. Check your assumptions. This is one of my colleagues. We were down in a silver mine in Chile testing some cool equipment that sends voice and data through solid rock. And they had 2 assumptions wrong when I came into that one. On the hardware side, we had brilliant engineers. I mean, they figured out how to send voice and data through 1,000 feet of solid rock. That's pretty impressive. But they live in the lab. To put this equipment in place in a mine, you literally had to unscrew the chassis, pull out circuit boards, wire things on, do a bit of soldering, put it all back together. Do you want to do it there? Didn't work. They were assuming that, well, these are technical people, they know how to do things, this isn't simple for us. And that's a pretty extreme example, but it's a real world example. You've got assumptions. The business didn't tell them, by the way, it's dirty and damp in mines, because they kind of thought you'd know that. Never assume. The other thing that these guys, and I shouldn't be slagging them because, like I said, they got signal through solid rock. It's very impressive. But they also made another fatal assumption, that the box would only ever be used when the power in the mine is turned off for an emergency. There's a lot of electromagnetic interference, especially 60 hertz, that was making it not work. So everywhere I went out to demonstrate how fabulous this stuff was, well, they're not having an emergency when we're demonstrating the equipment. It didn't work because there's too much interference. So we had to drive back in and put some filtering in and adjust the software side. But there was an assumption for 2 years of development that you'd never have the power on in mind when you're working because this is emergency gear. So when we got out in the field and we found, well, we want it for emergencies, but can we use it for areas of the mine where we don't have a full network built out yet? Can we use it for jumping from one network to the other through a place that's going to be hard to cable? Yeah, but only after they clean up the noise, because it didn't work when the EM was running. This is another favorite. Whenever you get a business requirement, if it's not dead obvious why they want it, ask. This picture reminds me of when my nephew was about 4 years old and my sister locked her keys in the car along with my niece. And Alan looked at her and just assumed that Mom must have a good reason and said, "Why'd you lock the baby in the car?" Couldn't figure it out. Of course, she didn't. And a lot of the requirements you get from the business have been thought through about as much, and I'm saying that I'm one of them, and I try to do better than most, but we all do it. You throw something out there, and you haven't really thought it through, and if somebody comes back and says, well, why do you want this? And Julio did that a lot on Squeeze last year, and as soon as he did, we were able to say, well, this is why we want it, and he'd say, okay, then how about we do this instead, because that would meet your need and not cause these 5 problems that your stupid requirement was giving me. So always push back and always ask why. If they don't know why, then they need to do some work. And one of my customers had a feature that they wanted to put on. It was going to be putting a cap on the number of transactions per month that the free users could do as opposed to everybody else. Came in and started looking at who's on market, what are we going to do, how do we get people engaged, upsell and so on. Upshot was we would never implement that cap. It would completely destroy the product. You want the free users to be able to use it as much as possible and just not get all the functionality. So we canned it. Problem was the dev team had spent 6 weeks building that feature already because the CEO had walked by one day and said, you know, I think we're going to need to put a cap on the number of transactions. A little too much flexibility, not enough structure. we had to put a little filter in place between the CEO and the dev team so that they knew when they should actually work on things. Off we go. It's hard to design for things that you don't necessarily need now. I love that cat. I'm a dog person, but I love that cat. A lot of times it's easy to take conventional wisdom and say, okay, they only need this much, and if we designed or built for more than that, it would be spending too much money, taking too much time, we'll just do the bare minimum. And a lot of times, if you put enough structure around the front that you can really understand where it may want to go later, you can actually build more options in and plan for the future, even if you're not building it now. Database structures are really key for that. If I come back to a product over and over and say, well, okay, now we want to do this, and the answer every time is, well, we'd have to completely redesign the database. They haven't planned for the future. When I come back and they say, 50% of the time we'd have to redesign, they've done it, because I'm still going to ask for things that the database can't do. You can't blame me for asking. But you want to, wherever possible, think about what's coming. We did a bunch of projects where we actually got stuff done at Rogers. I couldn't believe it. But we had an executive sponsor who was willing to make that investment in future. So my first couple of years there, we pushed some stuff out that had hooks and features and things that we didn't need for these projects, but they were on the roadmap. And we were able to get them done within the funded project without going outside the scope. So then when we came back 2 years later and said, now we want to do this, some of them had to do with making cable and wireless customers' information talk to one another. Anybody here have Rogers cable?
I try to avoid it.
If you've got Rogers cable and you've got Rogers wireless as well, keep your hand up. Yeah. Well, you're at least 2 different customers as far as Rogers is concerned, and I tried really hard to fix that. And they have some really cool underlying infrastructure right now that would fix that, but the executive team that was leading that is gone, so somebody else will have to try it. But at least when they're ready to do it, some of the infrastructure is there, because we didn't just do what we needed to do for today. And lastly, on the same note, flexibility. Please don't shut any doors you don't have to. There's always a lot of pushback back and forth with, don't build more than you have to, you don't want to bloat the scope and all that. But a lot of times you're making decisions about what to do. And if path number 1 leaves you 2 options, and path number 2 only 1, try to go path number 2, whichever one had 2 options, actually. And none of this is rocket science, but I hope my passion about it comes through, because I see a lot of folks who have just had the passion beat out of them, and you're down to, I'm just going to do what they tell me to do. And if you take away nothing else, developers, push back against your business folks, make them tell you why, make them give you flexibility even where there's structure. And business folks, make sure that the devs aren't assuming that they can't do stuff, because generally they do want to build it. They're just going to say, well, we'll get dumped on because it's going to take too long, it's going to be too complicated. You can often get a bit more scope built in there and funded, and everybody's happy if you've got a good rationale. And that means you have to have enough structure that everybody knows where you're trying to get to and why it's important to do that, but enough flexibility to change as you learn the business. And I think, yeah, that's it.